This time we are looking at the different types of errors. We understand that in statistics we are never 100% sure of anything. I know that's hard to accept, but we usually test things with either 99 or 95% confidence, which we talk about a significance level of 0.01 or 0.05. Because we're not testing with 100% confidence, which would be impossible unless, of course, we could survey the entire population, we have this room for error. And we have to think about how much error are we comfortable with, and what kinds of errors could be made. So let's think about our process of hypothesis testing. When we test a claim, we make a conclusion about the null hypothesis. Typically, the claim is in the alternative hypothesis. The null hypothesis is the statement with the equal to. Now, we rewrite our conclusions in terms of the problem we're solving. But at a very base level, we say there is evidence to reject the null hypothesis in favor of the alternative, or we say there is not evidence to reject the null hypothesis, or we might say we fail to reject the null hypothesis. In the first scenario, when we say there is evidence to reject the null hypothesis, we're essentially saying the null hypothesis is not true. When we say there is not evidence to reject the null hypothesis, we're essentially saying the evidence suggests that the null hypothesis is true. So when we compare these decisions to reality, we end up with 4 potential situations. Our conclusion, whether or not we reject the null hypothesis, is based on the evidence. The evidence, the information typically in our sample, may or may not be the reality. So our first scenario, we could reject the null, and the null is actually true in reality. Or we reject the null, and the null is actually false in reality. Third, we fail to reject the null, and the null is actually true in reality. And fourth, we fail to reject the null, and the null is actually false in reality. Now I want you to pause and go through these and see which ones would be good and which ones would be an error. They take some thought. And then when you think you've figured it out, continue with the video. So the first statement, we rejected the null. That means we think the null is not true. We rejected that information when the null is actually true. So that first scenario would be an error. Our second one, we rejected the null, so we think it's false, and the null is false, so that time we got it right, so that would be good. Third one, we failed to reject the null, so our evidence is saying the null is probably true, and the null is actually true. So we did good on that one. The final one, we failed to reject the null, so that means our evidence is telling us it looks like the null is true, but in reality the null is false. So that is our next error. Now our errors are of 2 different types. The first type of error is we rejected when we shouldn't have, and that is called a type 1 error. Our second error is we failed to reject when we should have, and so that is called our type 2 error. We'll look at each type of error a little bit more in depth, but our first thing is just to recognize what it means to make an error.